The mystery of the old village. Xuyen Dong village was deep in a small valley far from the city. The scenery was beautiful, but the village was full of eerie stories about an old grave. It was the grave of a woman named Lan. Every full moon night, villagers claimed to hear heartbreaking cries coming from the cemetery. Mai, a young girl who had just moved to the village with her family, didn't believe in ghosts. She thought the stories were just village rumors. However, one evening, when she passed the cemetery on her way to her grandmother's house, she felt a strange chill. She stopped in front of Lan's grave, a small but well-kept one, as if someone had taken care of it recently. Villagers whispered that Lan was a beautiful woman who died unfairly, and her spirit could not rest in peace. No one dared to go near her grave. Mai was curious. Who was Lan? What really happened to her? The strange grave. One evening, as the sun set, Mai decided to visit Lan's grave. She stepped into the cemetery, where old tombstones were covered in moss. The wind whispered through the trees, making the place feel even more eerie. As she stood before the grave, a cold breeze passed through her. She looked at the tombstone and noticed faint words. "Please don't forget me." The writing looked fresh, as if someone had carved it recently. Mai reached out to touch it, and the moment her fingers brushed the stone, an icy sensation ran through her body. She gasped and pulled back. Then, a soft voice whispered, "Help me." Mai's breath caught in her throat. She turned around, but no one was there. Her heart pounded. Who's there?" she stammered. Suddenly, behind the grave, a faint figure appeared, a woman in a white dress with long black hair, her face pale, her eyes empty. The nightmare terrified, Mai turned and ran. But no matter how fast she moved, she felt as if something was following her. The air around her grew heavy, and her legs felt weaker with each step. When she finally reached her grandmother's house, she slammed the door shut, gasping for breath. Her grandmother saw her pale face and asked, "You've seen her, haven't you?" Mai slowly nodded. Her grandmother sighed and pointed to an old photograph on the wall. It was a picture of a young woman wearing a white dress. "This is Lan. People say her husband killed her out of jealousy. She died unfairly, so her spirit wanders the village, looking for someone to free her." Mai couldn't believe it. Could the ghost of Lan really be calling out to her? A mysterious encounter. That night, the full moon shone brightly. As Mai lay in bed, she suddenly heard soft crying coming from outside. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the window. The sound came from the direction of the cemetery. The same chilling wind blew through the air. Mai knew she had to go back. She walked toward the graveyard, her heartbeat loud in her ears. When she arrived at Lan's grave, the ghost appeared again, clearer this time. Lan's sorrowful eyes locked onto Mai's. "What do you want from me?" Mai whispered, her voice shaking. Lan raised a trembling hand and pointed at her grave. Suddenly, a drop of fresh blood appeared on the tombstone. The curse. The next morning, Mai returned to the cemetery to investigate. Near Lan's grave, she found something strange, a small wooden box buried under the dirt. She opened it and found an old piece of paper with hurried, desperate writing. "If the promise is not fulfilled, the spirit will never rest." Mai felt a shiver run down her spine. She started researching Lan's past and discovered something horrifying. Lan's husband had betrayed her and killed her. But the truth was never revealed. To save Lan's spirit, Mai had to expose the killer. But as she dug deeper, she realized something chilling. The curse was now upon her. The ghost in the mirror. After discovering the grave's secret, Mai kept having nightmares about Lan. In her dreams, she stood in an old house facing a large mirror. Inside the mirror, Lan's reflection appeared, her eyes full of sorrow. "Help me," Lan whispered. Mai woke up in a panic, sweat dripping down her face. She turned on the light and looked around. Nothing seemed unusual, until she glanced at the mirror. A faint handprint had appeared on the glass, as if someone had just pressed their hand against it from inside. Terrified, Mai ran to her grandmother's room. "I think she's trying to talk to me," she cried. Her grandmother nodded grimly. "Her soul is still restless. If you don't help her, she won't leave you alone." Mai knew she couldn't ignore this any longer. She needed to find someone who knew about Lan's past. Mr. Hung's secret. Mai visited Mr. Hung, an old villager who had lived in Xuyen Dong for decades. When she mentioned Lan's name, his face darkened. "Her spirit is still here?" he whispered in shock. "I thought it was over." Mai leaned forward. Please tell me the truth. What really happened? Mr. Hung sighed and began to speak. Lan was a kind woman, but her husband was a monster. He had a mistress, and when Lan found out, he killed her. He made it look like suicide, so no one ever suspected him. Her soul has been trapped here ever since. Mai's hands clenched into fists. Who is her husband? Mr. Hung hesitated before answering. His name is Nam. He's still alive. Confronting the murderer, Mai couldn't believe it. The man who murdered Lan was still living in the village? She did some research and found out that Nam had become a wealthy and respected man. He lived in a large house with his new wife. One night, Mai sneaked into Nam's house to find proof. The house was dark and silent. As she climbed the stairs, she saw a dim light coming from one of the rooms. She stepped inside and gasped. Nam was sitting in a chair, motionless. His eyes were wide open, frozen in horror. His face was twisted in a silent scream. He was dead. On the wall behind him, blood-red words were scrawled. I have taken my revenge, but I still cannot rest. Mai's heart pounded. Lan had finally killed the man who destroyed her life. But if her revenge was complete, why was her spirit still here? A cold wind blew through the room and a whisper echoed in Mai's ear. One last thing remains. Mai realized with horror, Lan's story wasn't over, and neither was hers.